Clint Eastwood, the legend, the icon, never did anyone expect to see him walk into a courtroom, not as a witness, not as a guest, but as a defendant. But there he was, strolling into Judge Linda Holt's courtroom with that signature squint, the kind that made his admirers pause and his critics take a step back. A hush fell over the room as the doors swung open, and the man who had faced down armies of bad guys on the big screen now stood before the judge in a real-life drama. Judge Linda Holt glanced up from her papers, momentarily taken aback by the man who had just entered. She was no rookie. As one of the most respected judges in the state, she had seen it all, the shady businessmen, the hardened criminals, and the occasional celebrity trying to use their fame as a free pass. But Clint Eastwood? That was new. He didn't belong here. Or did he? Clint, looking every bit the aging but still formidable man he was, stood tall and calm, his signature cowboy hat perched just slightly askew on his head. His worn leather jacket creaked as he moved, the scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air around him. He wasn't here to charm anyone. Clint had no need to. His presence alone carried weight. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Holt finally spoke, her voice measured, "please take your seat." Clint nodded, giving her a respectful, though slightly amused, grin. He didn't rush, taking his time as if he were stepping onto a movie set instead of into a place that could alter the course of his life. The sound of his boots clicking on the wooden floor was like a countdown, ticking away the seconds until something unpredictable was about to unfold. As Clint sat down in the defendant's chair, his lawyer, Sarah Thomas, a woman who had been in the trenches of criminal law for over 20 years, leaned in to speak with him. Their conversation was low, and Clint's stoic expression never changed. He wasn't here because he wanted to be, no, there was something much deeper at play. Something that went beyond his past as a tough guy actor. It was a connection, one that only a few knew about, and none could understand fully. And as Clint sat there, silent, you could feel the tension slowly building. Everyone in that room could sense it, this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just about Clint Eastwood the actor. This was about Clint Eastwood, the man with a history buried deep in the shadows. Suddenly, the prosecutor, Mark Evans, stood. The young attorney's voice echoed through the room as he adjusted his glasses, prepared to face the legend who had walked into his courtroom like it was just another day. "Your Honor," Mark began, his voice sharp but with a hint of nervousness. "We are here today to address charges involving." Before Mark could finish, Clint stood up abruptly, causing everyone to freeze in place. His old, gravelly voice rang out like a thunderclap, cutting through the courtroom's silence. "I know why I'm here, son," Clint said, his tone calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind it. The room went quiet. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the audacity of Clint's statement. Was he just being his usual rebellious self, or was there something more? Judge Holt glanced between Clint and the prosecutor, a small frown crossing her face. "Mr. Eastwood, I will remind you to show respect for the proceedings." But Clint wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on the prosecutor, Mark, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of it. Clint didn't look like a man facing charges, he looked like a man who had been through far worse, and had lived to tell about it. "Don't worry about me, Your Honor," Clint said with a wink, sitting back down slowly, "I've had my fair share of respect. Just trying to save this poor kid from making a bigger mistake." The audience in the courtroom stiffened, as the tension that had been simmering for months in the air suddenly became palpable. What was going on here? Was this just a spectacle or was Clint Eastwood really caught in something deeper? Clint glanced at his lawyer, who gave him a reassuring nod. Sarah had been through more than enough courtrooms to recognize when things were about to go south. She had known Clint for years, not as a celebrity, but as a man with a mysterious past. The kind of past that only a select few knew about, and even fewer were willing to acknowledge. Clint leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped an octave. "You got to understand something, kid," he said, looking at the prosecutor like he was speaking to a child. "I didn't show up here by accident. This is personal. And if you're smart, you'll realize that. At that moment, a murmur spread across the courtroom. People turned to each other, whispering. Was Clint really who he said he was? Could there be more to him than the tough guy persona that had made him famous? Judge Holt looked down at her desk, her fingers drumming nervously on the wooden surface. She had heard of Clint's ties to powerful figures in law enforcement, rumors that had surfaced over the years about his mysterious relationship with the U.S. Secret Service, but she had never taken them seriously. Now, sitting in her courtroom, with Clint Eastwood's smirk widening as he casually dropped hints about connections, she couldn't ignore the fact that something big was at play. The prosecutor took a breath, his voice shaking slightly as he began to speak again. Your Honor, we are not here to discuss anything personal. I beg to differ, Clint interrupted, standing up again. You might want to rethink that, son. You've got no idea who you're dealing with. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Clint said them. There was no arrogance, no grandstanding. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had seen things no one else could imagine. The room fell into a stunned silence. All eyes were on Clint Eastwood. What was about to happen? Was this just another day for him? Or was this something much bigger, something far beyond the realm of this courtroom? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Judge Linda Holt wasn't an ordinary judge. She wasn't easily intimidated by fame, and she certainly wasn't one to get starstruck. Her entire career had been built on a reputation for running a tight courtroom, no nonsense, no room for error. She'd seen her share of celebrities try to pull strings in her courtroom, some succeeded, others didn't. But Clint Eastwood? He wasn't just another Hollywood name to her. No, there was something deeper about Clint that she couldn't quite shake, a history that lingered beneath the surface. As Clint settled back into his seat, she watched him closely. His face was as weathered as the American West, but there was a sharpness to his eyes that made it clear he was not a man you could easily deceive. She'd seen that look before, only a few people in her life had it. Clint's lawyer, Sarah Thomas, leaned over and whispered something to him. Clint gave a short nod, then folded his hands in front of him, leaning back in his chair like he was waiting for the storm to pass. But the storm wasn't going anywhere. Not today. Judge Holt couldn't help but feel a slight chill. She had worked her way up in the legal world the hard way, no shortcuts, no favors. And she knew when something didn't add up. This case, Clint Eastwood's case, didn't add up. It felt like the beginning of a long, winding road with no clear destination. The courtroom had begun to murmur again, the buzz of whispers growing louder with every passing second. The fact that Clint Eastwood had just flashed a USSS badge, a symbol of authority and power, had sent shockwaves through the room. But there was more. There was always more with Clint. As the whispers died down, the prosecutor, Mark Evans, cleared his throat. He had been thrown off by Clint's comment earlier, unsure whether it was a warning or just another one of Clint's classic moves to rattle his opponent. Mark was young, too young to have the kind of experience that might have helped him face off with someone like Clint. He was in over his head, and everyone in the room knew it. Mr. Eastwood, Mark said, trying to regain his composure, you claim to be above reproach, but we're here to discuss your involvement in a criminal conspiracy that has shaken our community. We're not here to talk about your fame or your connections. We're here to deal with the facts. Clint glanced at Sarah, who offered him a faint, reassuring smile. She knew how to handle these kinds of situations. Sarah was calm and methodical, a master of strategy. She had known Clint for years, not as the Hollywood legend, but as the man who had always kept his cards close to his chest. She had learned a long time ago that Clint didn't play by anyone's rules, not even his own. He played by his own code. Clint looked at Mark with a small, almost amused, smile. Son, I didn't come here to argue about facts. You and I both know that sometimes the truth is a little more complicated than what's written on paper. The words seemed to hang in the air, like smoke from an old cigar. Clint didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. It was the quiet confidence that he carried with him like a shield, one that could make even the toughest lawyers second-guess their own convictions. But Mark wasn't about to back down. "We will see about that," Mark replied, though his voice lacked the strength it had before. Judge Holt tapped her gavel gently, and the room fell silent again. She had been listening, carefully considering every word. She had her suspicions about Clint, though she wasn't about to voice them out loud, not yet, anyway. But there was something about him that she had recognized the moment he entered the courtroom. Something familiar. It wasn't just the USSS badge, no, it was the way Clint carried himself. He wasn't just some washed-up movie star trying to pull some strings behind the scenes. There was something more at play, something deeper. The way he had locked eyes with her earlier, a brief, silent exchange that left her feeling uneasy, was enough to make her wonder, what was Clint Eastwood really doing here? Flashbacks of her own life in law enforcement came to her as she watched Clint, all those years ago when she was still a young agent, fresh out of the academy. She had been assigned to work on a high-profile case that involved corruption at the highest levels of government. That was when she first encountered Clint, though she didn't know him by name at the time. He wasn't the actor, he was just a man, a figure in the shadows, working in ways she could barely comprehend. Over the years, those memories had stayed with her, though she had buried them deep. She had her career to focus on now. But seeing Clint Eastwood in her courtroom, casually tossing around mentions of government connections, had stirred up something she had long hoped to forget. For the first time in a long while, Judge Holt felt the weight of her own history. Was this a coincidence, or was Clint's appearance here today the beginning of something bigger? Before she could delve any further into her thoughts, Sarah Thomas spoke up, her calm, confident voice pulling the judge's attention back to the matter at hand. "Your Honor, if I may," Sarah began, "we request that the charges against my client be reviewed with a full understanding of the context. Mr. Eastwood is not here to obstruct justice. He is here because he has been wrongly accused. And we intend to prove it." Clint didn't say a word. He simply leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving the judge's face. Judge Holt took a deep breath, clearing her mind. It was her job to keep control of the proceedings, no matter how distracting or unsettling the presence of Clint Eastwood might be. But something told her this wouldn't be an easy case. The shadows of Clint's past seemed to stretch out from behind him, casting an undeniable presence that loomed over the courtroom. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Holt said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You've made your point. But the question remains, why are you really here?" Clint looked at her, his face expressionless. "You'll find out soon enough, Judge." And with that, the stage was set. The game had begun. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, like the quiet before a storm. Judge Linda Holt's gavel struck the desk, the echo sharp and final. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers. "We will continue with the hearing. Mr. Eastwood, you will answer the charges placed against you today, not with insinuations or vague statements. Do you understand?" Clint Eastwood, seated with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen far more danger than this, gave a short nod. He wasn't intimidated by Judge Holt's authority. After all, this wasn't his first time in a room full of people who thought they could control the situation. He had played the part of the hard-nosed cowboy, the grizzled detective, and the war-hardened soldier more times than he cared to remember. And this courtroom, felt like just another performance to him. But Clint wasn't here as a performer. No, he was here because something was very wrong. And he wasn't going to let anyone push him into a corner without revealing the truth. Mark Evans, the young prosecutor, looked flustered. He was trying hard to maintain composure, but Clint's nonchalance was throwing him off balance. "Mr. Eastwood, let's return to the issue at hand," Mark began, his voice slightly unsteady. You've been accused of conspiring with known criminal organizations. Your involvement in illegal arms deals, and more troubling, your connections with figures who are currently under investigation by federal authorities. Clint's gaze didn't waver. I've been accused of a lot of things in my life, kid, he said, his voice low and deliberate, but if you're looking for a confession, you're barking up the wrong tree. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just Clint's words, it was the way he spoke them. He didn't look like a man on the defense. He looked like a man who had been through 1,000 battles and come out on top every time. But then, just as the prosecutor was about to speak again, Clint did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and slowly pulled out a small, sleek badge. It was a simple piece of metal, with the emblem of the United States Secret Service stamped on it. A USSS badge. The room fell into a stunned silence. Clint held it up for all to see. The prosecutor's eyes went wide, and even Judge Holt's expression faltered for a moment as she processed the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. This was something much bigger. A man who had been linked to so many rumors and whispers, now casually flashing a badge that few would dare to question. The room felt as though the air had been sucked out of it. The young prosecutor, unable to hide his shock, stammered, "What? What does this mean, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He simply dropped the badge back into his pocket, giving a nonchalant shrug as though this was just another part of his routine. "It means," Clint said slowly, locking eyes with Mark, "that you're looking at the wrong man. I'm not who you think I am." Mark swallowed hard. The realization hit him, hard and fast. Clint Eastwood wasn't just the man who had starred in some of the most iconic films in history. He wasn't just a washed-up celebrity trying to get out of a tight spot. No, Clint Eastwood had a history. A history that ran deep into the halls of power. A history that could destroy careers if people weren't careful. But Clint wasn't done yet. Judge Holt, recovering from the shock of the badge's appearance, took a deep breath. "Mr. Eastwood, this is highly irregular," she began, her voice now carrying an edge of authority. "You cannot simply flash a badge and expect the court to overlook the charges against you. I am giving you one opportunity to clarify your position. What exactly is your involvement in this case?" Clint's expression softened, but there was a hardness in his eyes that suggested he wasn't ready to share all of his secrets. "Let's get something straight, Judge," Clint said, his tone calm but firm. "I've spent years working behind the scenes. Not just in movies, but in real life. The things I've seen, the people I've worked with, they're not the kind of people you read about in the papers. The accusations you've got against me, they're built on lies and misunderstandings." The prosecutor, still rattled, took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "But your connections." "Don't," Clint interrupted, his voice cold. "You don't know the first thing about those connections. So do yourself a favor and leave the guessing to the professionals." It was clear that Clint wasn't just fighting for his freedom in this courtroom. He was playing a much bigger game, one that involved power, secrecy, and perhaps even betrayal at the highest levels. Sarah Thomas, Clint's lawyer, had been silently observing the exchange, her face unreadable. She knew Clint well enough to understand that he was holding back. He was giving nothing away, leaving everyone in suspense. But Sarah was also aware that there was a delicate balance here. If Clint's connections were exposed too early, it could turn the tide against him. Judge Holt cleared her throat, her gavel coming down once more. "We will adjourn for a brief recess. Mr. Eastwood, we will reconvene shortly." She stood, signaling the end of the session, but Clint's eyes stayed locked on her. Something passed between them, something unspoken, a mutual understanding. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah leaned in close to Clint. "You can't keep this up forever," she said in a low voice. "You're playing with fire." Clint gave her a small, wry smile. "Maybe, but I've been burned before. It's nothing new." Outside the courtroom, the whispers had already begun. People in the hallways were talking about the USSS badge Clint had casually displayed. Some were in awe, others were downright frightened. The questions were piling up. Who was Clint Eastwood, really? What was his role in all of this? As Clint made his way out of the courtroom, flanked by Sarah, he kept his eyes forward. There was a storm brewing, and he wasn't sure where it would land. But one thing was certain, Clint Eastwood wasn't here by accident. And whoever was behind these charges would soon understand that they had just stirred up a hornet's nest. The recess felt like an eternity. Clint Eastwood didn't mind the silence, it gave him time to reflect. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight for the wrong reasons, but he knew better than anyone how to navigate situations where the world was watching. There were always strings to pull, connections to call, and favors to trade. But this time, the stakes were higher than they'd ever been before. Outside the courtroom, Sarah Thomas stood with him, her eyes scanning the hallway. She was more than just his lawyer, she was his anchor in a sea of uncertainty. But even Sarah knew that Clint was walking a fine line, one that could topple everything he had worked for in the past. "Clint," Sarah began, her voice quiet but firm, "we can't keep playing these games. You're digging yourself into a hole, and I'm not sure how we're going to get you out of it." Clint didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He knew Sarah was right, but there were things at play here that she didn't fully understand. The past wasn't something he could walk away from. It was always there, lurking in the background, and now, it had finally caught up with him. "I didn't come here to win, Sarah," Clint finally said, his voice gravelly. "I came here to make sure the truth gets out. And that's not something I can control." Sarah sighed, shaking her head. "Clint, you're not making any sense. You've always been in control, of your career, of the situations you found yourself in. But this is something else. These charges, the badge, they're not just going to go away." Clint looked at her, his expression unreadable. He knew she was worried, but there was a part of him that couldn't let go of the path he was on. If he walked away now, if he let this case go without standing his ground, he would be no better than the people he had spent his life trying to expose. "You don't get it, do you?" Clint muttered, his voice low. "This isn't about the charges. It never was." Before Sarah could respond, a young assistant rushed toward them, looking flustered. "Mr. Eastwood, Ms. Thomas," the assistant said, out of breath, "the judge wants to speak with you both. Right now." Without another word, Clint and Sarah followed the assistant down a narrow hallway and into a private office. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Judge Holt stood by the window, her back to them. "Take a seat," Judge Holt said without turning around. She didn't need to invite Clint or Sarah twice, they sat. Clint could feel the weight of her gaze, even though she hadn't yet made eye contact. There was something in the air, something heavy and unspoken, like a secret just waiting to be unveiled. "I've been doing this for a long time," Judge Holt said slowly, her voice quiet but authoritative. "And I've seen a lot of things. But I'll admit, this case is unlike anything I've encountered. You've thrown a wrench into the system, Mr. Eastwood. I don't know whether you're playing a game or trying to get ahead of something bigger. But I want you to know this." She turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not afraid of the people behind you. But I need to know what this is really about." Clint met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "It's about something that goes beyond this courtroom," he said, his voice steady. "You think I'm here because of the charges against me. But there's more, much more, at stake than that." Sarah frowned, glancing between Clint and the judge. "What are you talking about? What more could there be?" Clint leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "You're asking the wrong questions, Judge. The right question is, why are you even involved? What do you think you're really protecting by letting this play out? The people behind these charges aren't looking for justice, they're looking to bury the truth. And I'm the only one who can expose it. The room fell silent for a moment. Judge Holt didn't flinch, but Clint could see the shift in her eyes. There was something there, something deeper than her professional demeanor. A flicker of recognition, maybe. A momentary hesitation. "You're talking about something big," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if you're prepared for the consequences of pulling at that thread. You think this is just about you, Clint. But I'm telling you, it's not." Clint felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was why he was here, why he had taken this risk. The truth had to come out, no matter what. He wasn't backing down. "I'm prepared for anything," Clint said, his voice low but fierce. "And you should be too." The tension in the room was thick, like the calm before a storm. Judge Holt took a step back, her expression unreadable. She didn't say another word, but her silence was enough. It was clear that she was weighing her options, considering the implications of what Clint had just said. But before Clint or Sarah could speak again, the door opened. It was the assistant again, this time with a message. "Judge Holt," the assistant said nervously, "there's a development. It's urgent. You need to see this." Judge Holt's face hardened as she turned toward the assistant. "What is it?" "There's been a breach," the assistant replied, voice trembling. "We've just received word that someone in the courtroom, someone very high up, has been working with the defendants. It's bigger than we thought, Judge." Clint and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. This was exactly what Clint had been warning about. The deeper they dug, the darker the secrets became. The court case was no longer just about Clint Eastwood. It was about something far more dangerous. Judge Holt's face tightened, her professional facade slipping for the first time. "I need to see everything you have on this," she said sharply. "Now." As the assistant left to retrieve the files, Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes still locked on the judge. "You wanted to know what this is about," Clint said softly. "Now you'll see. And when you do, you'll understand that this isn't a game. This is real." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with concern. "Clint, what have we gotten ourselves into?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the judge. The storm was about to break, and there was no turning back. The storm was coming, and it wasn't just in the weather outside. It was in the tension-filled air of Judge Holt's office, where Clint Eastwood sat, waiting for the inevitable reveal. He could feel it, a shift, a subtle disturbance that told him the pieces were falling into place. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, Clint knew it wasn't just about him anymore. The higher-ups were moving their pieces, and soon, the truth would spill out. Judge Holt didn't speak right away. She stared at the door, waiting for the assistant to return with the information that would reveal who had been playing dirty behind the scenes. Sarah, seated next to Clint, looked uneasy, her fingers tapping nervously against her notepad. It was clear she was feeling the weight of the situation, too. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore, it was a battle for survival. And Clint was at the center of it. When the assistant returned, holding a thick file in his hands, Clint's heart skipped a beat. The look on the young man's face said it all. The game had changed, and whatever they were about to uncover, it was going to shake the very foundations of everything Clint had worked for. Judge Holt didn't waste a moment. She snatched the file from the assistant's hand and opened it quickly, scanning the contents. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages, and Clint couldn't help but watch her closely. This wasn't just a revelation for her, it was a revelation for all of them. Sarah leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it, Clint? What do you think is in there?" Clint didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, thinking back to the few times in his career when things had gotten this dangerous. There were whispers in the shadows, rumors about people with too much power, too much influence, playing both sides of the law. But Clint had never imagined it would reach this level. Not in his wildest dreams. Judge Holt finally looked up from the file, her face pale but determined. "This is bigger than I thought," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "We're dealing with someone at the top." Clint's gut twisted. The fact that she hadn't mentioned names yet only added to his anxiety. But there was one thing Clint knew for sure: whoever was at the top, whoever had been pulling the strings, they weren't just targeting him. This was bigger than a single man. It was a network, a hidden enemy with the power to destroy anyone who got in their way. "Who?" Sarah asked, her voice firm. "Who's behind this?" Judge Holt hesitated, glancing at the file again. She seemed torn, like she wasn't sure how much she should reveal. After a moment, she set the file down and looked directly at Clint. "The people behind this, these charges against you, are tied to some of the most powerful figures in the government. There's a mole in the system, someone we've all trusted." Clint's eyes narrowed. He had known something wasn't right from the start, but this was beyond anything he'd expected. "You're telling me that the charges aren't just some random attack?" Clint's voice was low but steady, the calm before the storm. "That there's a deliberate conspiracy to bring me down?" Judge Holt didn't answer directly, but the look on her face said everything. "Yes. And it's not just you, Clint. You've been caught up in something far more dangerous. Whoever is behind this has their eyes on something bigger, and you're a part of it." A chill ran down Clint's spine. He had been involved in plenty of dangerous situations in his life, but this felt different. This felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, with no way to know what awaited him at the bottom. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with urgency. "We expose them," Clint replied without hesitation. "We get to the bottom of this. We pull the thread until it unravels everything." Judge Holt's eyes softened, but her expression remained serious. "You need to be careful. Whoever's behind this is powerful. They have resources, allies in high places. Exposing them will be risky, dangerous." Clint stood up slowly, his eyes steady as he looked at the judge. "I didn't come this far to back down now, Judge. If they think they can pull the wool over everyone's eyes, they've got another thing coming." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Clint's words hanging in the air. It was clear that Clint wasn't just talking about a legal battle anymore. He was talking about a war, a fight for something far more important than his own freedom. He was ready to take on whatever came his way, no matter the cost. But just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the office opened again. This time, it wasn't an assistant or anyone involved in the case. It was a man in a dark suit, his face stern and unreadable. "Clint Eastwood," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "We need to talk. Now." Clint didn't move, his eyes locked on the man. There was something familiar about him, something Clint couldn't quite place. But one thing was certain: this wasn't a random encounter. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp, protective. The man didn't answer right away. He simply stepped forward, holding out a badge that looked eerily similar to Clint's USSS badge. The realization hit Clint like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone from his past, a connection he thought had been severed long ago. Clint stood, his posture shifting from calm to alert. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low, almost growling. "We need you to come with us," the man replied. "There's been a development. And it's not good for you." Clint exchanged a look with Sarah, who looked just as unsettled as he felt. The pieces were falling into place, but now the real game was about to begin. Clint knew one thing for sure: whoever was pulling the strings in this game wasn't about to let him walk away. Not without a fight. And he was ready to give them one. The moment the man with the badge entered the room, Clint's instincts went on high alert. His eyes narrowed, a mix of recognition and suspicion flooding his mind. He had seen that badge before, that shiny, intimidating emblem. It was the same one he'd worn for years, serving in a capacity that few knew about, even fewer understood. The U.S. Secret Service. He had been part of a shadowy world, a world where secrets and danger went hand in hand. And now, this man was here, dragging Clint back into that world. The stranger's eyes didn't waver as Clint stood, the tension thick in the air. He wasn't here for pleasantries or small talk. This wasn't about protocol, it was about a message, and Clint could feel it pulsing through the room. "You're a hard man to find, Eastwood," the stranger said, his voice low and calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "I've been looking for you for a while." Clint crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "I don't know you. And you're trespassing in a place you don't belong." The man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I'm not here to play games, Clint. You've been playing your part in something much bigger than you think. And I've come to tell you, it's time to stop running from it." Sarah's eyes flickered between the two men, her concern written across her face. "Clint, what's going on? Who is this guy?" Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, his thoughts circling around the man standing before him. He had never seen this man before, at least, not in person, but Clint knew a thing or two about the world he used to inhabit. This was someone from that world. Someone with connections. Someone who knew far more than Clint was ready to hear. Finally, Clint broke the silence. "Who are you? What do you want?" The stranger's eyes softened, as if Clint's question was something he'd been expecting. "You know who I am, Clint. You just don't want to remember. I'm part of the old crew. The ones who kept the lights on when the world didn't want to see what was really going on. The ones who did the jobs that no one else could, or would, do. You were part of that once. You just forgot." The words hit Clint like a cold wave. Memories, long buried, started to rise to the surface. The old days, when he worked under the radar, when he operated in the shadows, gathering intelligence, protecting the unprotectable, and making choices that weren't always pretty but were necessary. The things he had done in those days were better left in the past, forgotten. He had moved on. He thought he had escaped. But now, this man, this ghost from his past, was pulling him back into a world he thought he had left behind. Clint's pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of unease. This wasn't a simple case anymore. It never had been. The stranger stepped closer, his voice quiet but forceful. "Clint, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the people who control everything. The ones who play with the rules and the laws, bending them to their will. They've been using you, whether you realized it or not." Clint's mind raced. "What do you mean, using me?" "You've been a pawn in their game for years, Clint. You were the perfect cover. The perfect distraction. You've been used to shield the truth while they pull the strings behind the scenes. But now," the stranger paused, his eyes hardening. "Now they've made their move, and they want you out of the picture. They'll do anything to make sure you never get the chance to expose them." Clint felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed was a whole different story. The people who had been pulling the strings all this time, he had been their tool, their puppet. The weight of that realization hit him hard. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting for his life. Sarah moved closer, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Clint, what is he talking about? You've been a part of something big, but, how could you not know?" Clint didn't know how to explain it. He didn't even know how to begin to untangle the mess he'd found himself in. But there was one thing he was sure of, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was a battle for the truth. A battle to expose the powerful figures hiding behind the shadows. Clint turned to the man, his voice steady. "You want me to expose them? But why? What do you get out of this?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed Clint a sealed envelope. Because I've got nothing left to lose. And neither do you. Clint took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the cold paper. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, typed with a name, one that Clint recognized immediately. It was the name of someone he hadn't seen in years, someone he had once trusted implicitly. The man's name was Robert Dunn. Robert Dunn, Clint repeated, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. He's the one behind all of this. The stranger nodded. Yes. He's been the mastermind for years. And now he's coming for you. Clint's mind was spinning. Dunn was a name from his past, a name that was connected to some of the darkest operations Clint had ever been a part of. The fact that Dunn was involved in this case made everything clearer, and at the same time, more dangerous. Dunn wasn't just a player in this game, he was the one pulling the strings. Clint stood up slowly, his mind still racing. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. And he needed to act fast. Get out, Clint said, his voice cold. I'm done talking. If Dunn wants me, he's going to have to come find me himself. The stranger didn't flinch. He simply turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back and said, "You'll regret this, Clint. But you don't have much time." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Clint and Sarah alone in the room. The silence that followed was deafening. "Clint, we need a plan," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "We need to act before it's too late." Clint didn't respond immediately. He was lost in thought, his mind reeling from the bombshell that had just been dropped on him. But deep down, he knew what had to be done. "We'll expose Dunn," Clint said finally, his voice full of resolve. "We'll take him down. No matter what it takes." Clint Eastwood stood motionless, staring at the closed door through which the man had just exited. The weight of the revelations was sinking in deeper with every passing second. Robert Dunn. The name echoed in his mind like a gunshot, sharp and unforgiving. He'd worked with Dunn years ago, and had never imagined that he was the one pulling the strings all along. The shock of it was a bitter pill to swallow, but Clint knew one thing for sure, this wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. This was a full-scale war, and Robert Dunn had just become his greatest enemy. Sarah's voice broke through Clint's thoughts. "Clint, we don't have time. We have to act now before they come for you." Clint turned to her, his expression grim. He knew she was right. He had spent too many years hiding from the dark side of his past, but now the past had come crashing into the present. It was impossible to hide anymore. And if he didn't move quickly, Dunn would make sure he never got the chance to fight back. Clint walked over to the desk and grabbed the envelope that the mysterious man had handed him. He opened it slowly, pulling out the sheet of paper with Robert Dunn's name typed across it. The paper wasn't just a warning, it was a message, a declaration of war. Dunn wasn't just going to sit back and watch Clint unravel his operation. Dunn wanted him silenced. And Clint had to be ready for whatever came next. "Sarah," Clint said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his mind. "I need to make a few calls. I need to get us some backup." Sarah nodded, her face tense with worry but also determination. "You're right. We need help, and we need to be one step ahead of them. But Clint, be careful. You've seen how ruthless they are. They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes." Clint gave her a brief nod, acknowledging the gravity of her words. "I know. I've been in situations like this before. But this is different. This is personal. And I'm not going to let them get away with it." He reached for his phone, his fingers brushing over the screen as he began to scroll through his contacts. Each name he passed over carried weight, people he had once trusted, people who knew what it meant to live in the shadows. It had been years since he had called upon any of them, but now, he had no choice. The first call he made was to an old friend, someone Clint had met during his time in the Secret Service. A man named Jack Turner, a former field agent with a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for survival. Jack had been out of the game for years, but Clint knew he could trust him. He needed Jack's expertise, especially with Dunn's operation threatening to dismantle everything Clint had worked for. Clint waited for the phone to ring, his mind racing with strategies and plans. When Jack finally answered, his voice was thick with suspicion but laced with familiarity. "Clint. Is this really you? What the hell's going on?" "Jack, I need your help," Clint said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm being set up, and the man behind it all is Robert Dunn. He's got ties to some very dangerous people, and I need to take him down before it's too late." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Clint could hear Jack's breath steadying as he processed the information. "Dunn. Damn, Clint, I thought he was out of the picture. Last I heard, he was laying low. But if he's involved in this, you're right to be worried. I'll be there. Just say when." "I need you here tonight," Clint replied without hesitation. "This isn't just about us anymore. Dunn has power, too much power, and if we don't act fast, he's going to destroy everything." Jack's voice softened, but Clint could hear the resolve in it. "I'll be there. Hang tight, Clint. We've got this." After hanging up, Clint felt a small sense of relief. Jack was on his way, but Clint knew the hardest part was still ahead. The clock was ticking. Dunn wasn't going to let this drag on for long. Clint had to figure out how to expose him, before Dunn turned the tables and wiped out everyone standing in his way. As night fell, the urgency of the situation only deepened. Clint and Sarah worked quickly to organize their next steps. They knew they couldn't trust anyone else, not yet. Not with the way Dunn's influence stretched across so many levels of power. It was just the two of them, a handful of allies, and a whole lot of risk. But Clint wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything that had been exposed. Just as Clint was about to dial another number, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number, but Clint's eyes narrowed as he read the message. "You're playing a dangerous game, Clint. Come to the old warehouse on 5th and Main. Bring no one. Or this ends for you tonight." The message was clear, Dunn was watching. He was ready to make his move. But Clint wasn't one to be intimidated. He'd been through too much, seen too much, to back down from a challenge. He could feel his pulse quickening, adrenaline surging through his veins. This was the moment he'd been preparing for his entire life, the moment where everything he knew, everything he'd fought for, would be tested. Clint looked at Sarah, who was standing by the door, her face filled with concern. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clint clenched his jaw, then slid his phone into his pocket. "I'm going to that warehouse. But you stay here. Jack's on his way, and you need to be ready in case things go south." Sarah's eyes darkened, her protective instincts flaring. "I'm not letting you do this alone. You need backup, Clint." Clint met her gaze, his voice firm. "I can't risk it, Sarah. If this is a trap, I can't put you in danger." Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Just be careful, Clint. You know what's at stake." He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his coat, headed toward the door, and stepped into the night. Every step he took was one closer to either victory or disaster. He wasn't sure which one it would be, but he was determined to find out. Clint's heart was pounding in his chest as he stepped into the cool night air, the sound of his boots echoing down the empty street. The city felt quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Clint wasn't fooled. He knew something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good. His hand instinctively moved to the side of his jacket, where the concealed pistol was hidden. It was a safety net, a familiar comfort, but he knew it wasn't enough. The odds were stacked against him. He had been through dangerous situations before, but the message he received from Dunn, "Come alone," felt like a clear warning. As Clint made his way to the old warehouse on 5th and Main, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. The walls of this city, the familiar streets, were all part of the web that Dunn had created, and Clint had just walked right into the heart of it. When he arrived at the warehouse, its dark silhouette loomed like a giant, oppressive shadow against the moonlit sky. The heavy doors of the structure were wide open, revealing an eerie silence inside. There were no lights, no sounds, just the steady rhythm of Clint's breathing as he stepped inside. He moved carefully, every sense alert, every muscle tensed. His eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. But it was quiet. Too quiet. Then, a door creaked open in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Clint's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, his gaze sharp as he adjusted to the darkness. The steps grew louder, and Clint took cover behind a stack of old crates. The atmosphere inside the warehouse was thick with tension, he could feel the trap closing in. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. A voice, calm but laden with authority, rang out in the silence. "Well, well, Clint Eastwood. You're still alive after all these years." Clint's eyes flickered to the direction of the voice, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. He recognized the man's voice instantly. "Dunn," Clint muttered under his breath. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light from the open door. Robert Dunn. He looked much older than Clint remembered, his once sharp features now marred by age and the weight of years spent in power. But his eyes, cold and calculating, hadn't changed. Clint could still see the same ruthlessness that had made him a force to be reckoned with in the world of politics, intelligence, and crime. Clint stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't going to make the first move, but he was ready. Dunn wasn't the type of man to make small talk, and Clint wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of drawing things out. "You're looking well," Clint said, his voice steady. "I'm surprised you're still in the game, Robert. I figured you'd have retired by now." Dunn's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "Retirement? That's for people who have something left to lose. I don't. And you, Clint? You've got a lot to lose. That's why we're here, isn't it? Because I've come to collect." Clint narrowed his eyes, his hand still resting lightly on his gun. "You've been pulling the strings all this time, haven't you, Robert? From behind the scenes. Using people like me to do your dirty work while you sit back and reap the rewards. I should have known better than to trust you." Dunn's smile didn't fade. "You're a smart man, Clint. Smarter than most. But you were always a pawn in my game. I needed you to believe you had control, to think you were making your own decisions. It made you the perfect tool. You've been playing your part just like everyone else. But now the game has changed." Clint's pulse quickened, and he felt a rush of adrenaline as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Dunn wasn't just after Clint because of something that had happened in the past. This was bigger. Dunn had orchestrated everything. He had been the puppeteer, pulling the strings, manipulating people like Clint into his web, using them as pawns in a much larger scheme. The realization hit Clint like a cold wave. "So, this was all part of your plan. You knew exactly how I'd react. You've been setting me up from the start." "Not just you," Dunn corrected, his tone soft but deadly. "Everyone. You were just the most convenient. But now that you've come to your senses, you'll understand why you need to be out of the picture." Clint's hand tightened around the gun, but he didn't draw it just yet. He wasn't stupid. He knew better than to reveal his hand too soon. The shadows were thick around him, and he could feel the presence of others in the dark corners of the warehouse. Dunn had brought backup. He was waiting for Clint to make his move. "I'm not going anywhere, Robert," Clint said, his voice firm. "And neither are you. If you want me out of the picture, you're going to have to kill me. Dunn's eyes flashed with something dark, something predatory. If I wanted you dead, Clint, you wouldn't be standing here right now. But you're a problem, and I can't afford for you to keep digging into things you don't understand. Clint took a step forward, his stance defiant. I understand plenty. Enough to know you're not getting away with this. The tension in the room was suffocating. The moment had come. Clint wasn't sure how this was going to end, but he was ready. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, his senses heightened, every nerve firing. This was no longer just a battle for survival, it was a battle for everything Clint had fought for. And in this moment, he realized something that was as cold as it was liberating: there was no way out but through. He wasn't running anymore. This was the final confrontation. Before he could make his move, Dunn raised his hand. I think we've said enough. The rest of your backup won't be coming. You've got one chance, Clint. Walk away. Leave, and forget you ever knew my name. Or stay, and I'll make sure you regret it. Clint's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes locked on Dunn's. He had no idea what Dunn had planned, but one thing was certain: this would be a fight to the death. The atmosphere in the warehouse thickened as Clint and Robert Dunn locked eyes. The shadows around them seemed to move, closing in, but Clint's focus was razor-sharp. He could hear the distant hum of city traffic through the cracks of the warehouse walls, but inside, it felt like time had come to a standstill. Dunn's posture was relaxed, almost too much so. As if he were already convinced the outcome was certain. Clint couldn't let that happen. Not when he had come so far. Clint's pulse raced, but he held himself still, his hand inching toward the pistol. His grip tightened ever so slightly, the cold metal reassuring him in the moment. But he couldn't act too hastily. Dunn was a master at reading people, and Clint couldn't afford to give him an opening. You really think you're going to stop me? Dunn's voice broke the silence. His tone was smooth, almost mocking. You're just a relic, Clint. A washed-up agent trying to play in a world you don't understand anymore. Clint's eyes flicked briefly to the corners of the room, but he didn't let Dunn see the hesitation. He could sense movement, but there was no sign of anyone else yet. He didn't know if this was just a mind game to make him panic, but Clint couldn't take any chances. He had to finish this, here, now. I understand more than you think, Clint said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of fury. And I know this game better than you do. You might have people in the shadows, Robert, but I'm not alone anymore. The words hung in the air for a moment, tension crackling between them. Clint didn't take his eyes off Dunn, his every instinct screaming to stay alert. He could almost hear the gears turning in Dunn's head. But the thing about Robert Dunn was, Clint realized, was that he always underestimated his enemies. He thought Clint was just a pawn, a tool to be used and discarded. He was wrong. Clint's hand finally rested on the handle of the pistol beneath his jacket, and the slightest shift in his stance signaled his readiness. But Dunn didn't flinch. Instead, he gave Clint a slow, almost pitying smile. You think you have the upper hand? You think that old gun and a couple of old tricks will save you? Dunn chuckled darkly. You've always been stubborn, Clint. Always the hero. But heroes don't get to win in my world. Before Clint could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness. One by one, figures began to emerge from the shadows, people Clint hadn't seen in years. Some were familiar faces, others were new, but all of them wore the same cold, calculating expression. They were Dunn's men, loyal and well-trained. The odds were suddenly stacked against Clint, but he refused to back down. Ah, there they are, Clint said, his voice barely a whisper. You're back up. Dunn's grin widened. What did you expect, Clint? A fair fight? Clint didn't wait. With the speed of a seasoned agent, he drew his pistol, firing 2 quick shots. The first missed, but the second found its mark. One of Dunn's men crumpled to the ground, clutching his side. The others didn't hesitate. Gunfire erupted around Clint as they opened fire. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding a spray of bullets. The sound of gunshots rang in his ears, and his mind raced, calculating his next move. He couldn't take them all on at once, but he could do enough damage to level the playing field. Rolling behind a metal beam, Clint took a deep breath, his hands steady. His body was reacting on instinct now, trained reflexes kicking in as he peered out from behind his cover. The first man came into view, his weapon raised, ready to fire. Clint fired first. The shot rang out, and the man dropped. Another moved in from the left, but Clint had already predicted the move. He turned, firing in a fluid motion, striking his target in the chest. 2 down, but Clint was still outnumbered. But he was no stranger to a fight. Clint knew how to fight dirty, how to use his surroundings to his advantage. As another man advanced, Clint grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it, knocking the man off balance. A second later, Clint was on him, his fist connecting with the man's jaw before Clint snatched the gun from his hand. Behind him, Dunn barked orders, his voice rising in fury. "Get him! Don't let him escape!" Clint moved swiftly, his mind working faster than his heart could beat. He took a deep breath and made his way toward the high ground. The moment he reached a raised platform, he saw a figure darting for cover on the far side of the warehouse. Dunn. Clint's eyes narrowed. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He didn't know how long he had before more of Dunn's men swarmed him, but he had to act now. The element of surprise was the only thing he had left. He crept toward Dunn's position, keeping low to the ground, his steps silent on the concrete. As he approached, he could see Dunn's back turned, giving Clint the perfect opportunity. But just as Clint moved to strike, Dunn spun around, his own gun raised, a maniacal smile on his face. "You really thought I'd give you a chance, Clint?" Clint's mind raced, and everything around him seemed to slow down. This was it. There was no way out. This was the final confrontation. Clint's pulse hammered in his ears, but he remained calm, his eyes fixed on Dunn's hand. The gun was aimed straight at him. "You should have stayed out of this, Clint," Dunn spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. Clint didn't wait for the shot. He lunged forward with all his strength, knocking the gun out of Dunn's hand and sending them both crashing to the ground. They grappled, the fight ferocious and primal. Clint's fist connected with Dunn's face once, twice, but Robert was no slouch. He fought back with brutal force, his hands locking around Clint's throat in a death grip. Clint gasped for breath, his vision beginning to blur. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He wasn't going to die here. Not after everything. With a surge of strength, Clint threw his elbow back, connecting with Dunn's ribs. Dunn groaned, loosening his grip just enough for Clint to break free. Clint scrambled to his feet, breathless but driven by sheer willpower. The room seemed to tilt around him as he grabbed a nearby piece of metal, sharp, jagged, and heavy. Without a second thought, Clint swung it down toward Dunn, his aim true. The metal struck Dunn's arm, sending him stumbling back with a shout of pain. Clint stood over him, the fight finally out of his system. His heart was pounding, but there was no time to savor victory. Dunn was still alive, still dangerous. "You've lost," Clint said, his voice hoarse. "This ends tonight." Dunn's eyes darkened, but Clint wasn't fooled. He had won this round. And whatever came next, Clint was ready. The heavy weight of the silence after the struggle felt suffocating. Clint stood over Robert Dunn, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands slick with sweat and blood. The battle had taken everything out of him, his strength, his resolve, but he wasn't done yet. Not when the stakes were so high. Dunn lay on the ground, struggling to push himself up, his eyes burning with hatred. The blood from the wound on his arm trickled down his shirt, staining the fabric dark. Clint's gun was still in his hand, the barrel aimed directly at Dunn's face. The moment felt frozen in time, a standoff between two men who had spent years fighting each other from the shadows. Dunn's lips curled into a wicked grin. It was a smile that sent a chill through Clint's bones. "You think it's over, Clint? You think you've won?" Clint didn't flinch. He knew better than to trust anything Dunn said. There was always a catch with this man. Always a second plan, a hidden trap. Dunn wasn't the type to go down without one last play. "I'm not the one who's about to lose," Clint replied, his voice cold and steady. "You're done." Dunn's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "You really believe that, don't you?" His voice had taken on a darker edge, a hint of something sinister underneath the words. "You think taking me down will fix everything? That it will solve your little puzzle?" Clint's brow furrowed. There was something in Dunn's tone that unsettled him. For a moment, Clint hesitated, his mind racing through the implications of what Dunn was implying. What did he mean by puzzle? "You don't understand," Dunn continued, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "You're so focused on me, on taking me out of the equation, but you're missing the bigger picture." Clint's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't fire. He had learned long ago to never rush into things. "What bigger picture?" he asked, his tone sharp. "This is over. Your game's finished." Dunn shook his head slowly, the blood dripping from his arm now a small puddle on the ground. "It's not over. Not by a long shot. You're in over your head, Clint. You've been for a long time." He grinned again, a flash of malice in his eyes. "You've been chasing ghosts. I was never the real threat." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "Not the real threat?" Before Clint could process the words, Dunn continued, his voice growing more intense. "The people I work for, the ones who actually pull the strings, they've been waiting for you. They've been watching you. They knew you'd eventually catch on. That's why they planted me here. To set you up, to make you think you were in control. But you were always just a pawn in their game, Clint." Clint's stomach twisted. He had always suspected that Dunn's power wasn't just personal, it had always seemed like there was something larger at play. But to hear it confirmed in such a chilling manner made Clint's blood run cold. Who was Dunn working for? "You're telling me this is all part of some bigger plan?" Clint asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. He couldn't understand it. Everything he had fought for, every move he'd made, seemed to be based on this one man, on stopping Dunn. The idea that there was something bigger than that, something lurking in the shadows beyond Dunn, was almost too much to grasp. Dunn gave a slow, mocking nod. "You finally get it, Clint. It was never about me. It was about the people behind me. The ones who've been pulling the strings from the start. You've been chasing a shadow, and now you're finally starting to see the truth." Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still gaps. He had come here for one thing, to bring down Robert Dunn, but now he realized that his fight had been only a small part of a much larger war. Just then, Clint heard the sound of footsteps behind him. His senses instantly went on high alert, and he spun around, pistol raised. But there was no immediate threat. Instead, he saw a familiar figure stepping out of the shadows, his old friend and fellow agent, Sarah Fields. "Clint, don't shoot!" Sarah called out, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. Clint's hand lowered slightly, but his guard didn't drop. "Sarah?" His voice was a mixture of confusion and caution. "What are you doing here?" Sarah's face was grim, her eyes sharp as she approached him. "I'm here to help. But we're running out of time." Clint's gaze flickered back to Dunn, who was still lying on the floor, a smug look on his face despite his injury. "Help?" Clint repeated. "With him? Or with whatever game you've been playing behind my back?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering to Dunn. It's bigger than just Dunn, Clint. I've been following the same trail as you. But what you don't understand is that there are people, powerful people, who have been using us both. They've been manipulating us for years. Clint's head spun. He had always trusted Sarah. She was one of the few people he had known he could rely on. But now, the weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Manipulating us? You've been playing me too. Clint's voice was low, but the betrayal stung like a physical wound. Sarah shook her head quickly. No, Clint. I never wanted this. But I didn't have a choice. None of us did. There's a shadow organization, a network of elites pulling strings behind every major decision you've seen in your career. They've been running everything from the shadows, and Dunn was just a small piece of their puzzle. Clint took a step back, his mind reeling. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was it all a lie? Had every choice he made been part of someone else's plan? Dunn, seeing the confusion in Clint's eyes, seized the opportunity to laugh weakly, the sound grating against Clint's nerves. It's too late now, Clint. You've crossed the line. There's no going back. You can't stop it. You're just a cog in a machine you'll never understand. Clint's grip on his gun tightened again, but he didn't fire. Not yet. There was still so much to process, so many pieces that didn't add up. But one thing was clear, Dunn wasn't the mastermind. He was just the messenger. And if there was one thing Clint knew, it was that the real enemy, whoever they were, was still out there, watching. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The room felt smaller now, the weight of everything Clint had learned pressing down on him. His heart was still racing, his mind racing even faster. Sarah stood before him, her face a mixture of guilt and urgency, while Robert Dunn, bloodied and broken on the floor, seemed to be reveling in his twisted victory. But the truth was clear now, Dunn wasn't the mastermind. He was only a piece in a much larger, far more dangerous puzzle. Sarah's words echoed in Clint's mind. A shadow organization. A network of elites controlling the world from the darkness. Every piece of information Clint had gathered over the years suddenly felt insignificant. What if everything he had believed in was a lie? What if the enemies he had fought for so long were just distractions to keep him occupied while the real players remained hidden? Clint shook his head, trying to clear the chaos from his thoughts. Sarah, he said, his voice steady but filled with the anger of betrayal, how long have you known? Sarah's gaze fell to the floor. She couldn't meet his eyes. Since the beginning, Clint. I was assigned to watch you. To keep you in check. Clint's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. Assigned to watch me? His mind raced through every moment he had shared with Sarah, every mission they had worked together. How could he have been so blind? The trust they had built, the friendship, was it all a lie? But Sarah quickly raised her eyes, her expression hardening with resolve. But I didn't want this, Clint. I didn't have a choice. I've been doing my best to unravel this from the inside, but it's bigger than any of us. Clint narrowed his eyes. Who's behind this? Who's really pulling the strings? I don't know, Sarah admitted, her voice tight with frustration. That's the thing. The higher you go, the fewer answers there are. I've been following leads for months, trying to find out more. But everything is so compartmentalized. The organization doesn't operate like anything we've seen. It's everywhere, embedded in governments, corporations, media, everywhere. And they're always 3 steps ahead. Clint's blood ran cold. He had spent his life taking down criminals, dismantling networks of power and corruption, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had always believed that he was working towards something meaningful. But now, the very foundation of his life seemed to crumble beneath him. You've been working with them, Clint said, his voice thick with disbelief. You were part of the system. No, Sarah responded quickly. Not by choice. I've been trying to stop them from within. But every time I make progress, it feels like they pull me back in. They know everything. They watch everyone. Her voice softened. Clint, we don't have much time. They're going to come for us soon. Clint's gaze shifted back to Dunn, who was slowly getting to his feet. Despite his injuries, there was an eerie confidence about him. He was more dangerous than ever now, knowing that Clint was beginning to understand just how deep the conspiracy went. Dunn's eyes flicked between Clint and Sarah. You think you're going to stop them? You think you can fix this? I'm just a small part of a much bigger plan. You don't even know who you're really dealing with. Clint's grip tightened on his gun, but he held himself in check. He couldn't afford to make a rash decision. Not yet. He needed answers. He needed to know who was really pulling the strings before he did anything. But Sarah's voice broke through the tension. Clint, listen to me. I know what you're thinking. You want revenge. You want to finish this. But you can't do it alone. You need me. We need each other if we're going to take this down. Clint's eyes locked onto hers. She was right. He had been working alone for too long, pushing people away, relying only on himself. But that had gotten him nowhere. Maybe it was time to change tactics. Fine, Clint said, his voice cold but resolute. We'll work together. But this ends with Dunn. He knows something. He's not leaving this warehouse alive. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to Dunn. Clint, you don't understand. Dunn doesn't have all the answers. He's just a messenger. We need to find the head of the snake. Clint didn't answer immediately. He was tired of running in circles, tired of being betrayed. But there was still one thing he could do, take down Dunn. Even if Dunn wasn't the mastermind, Clint had no intention of letting him walk away. Not after everything he had done. You're not going anywhere, Clint growled. I'll make sure of that. Just as Clint was about to move toward Dunn, the sound of a phone ringing sliced through the tension in the air. It was an unfamiliar ringtone, sharp and urgent. Sarah pulled a phone from her pocket, her face draining of color as she stared at the screen. Clint saw the change in her instantly. She was no longer the woman he had once trusted, this wasn't the Sarah he knew. This was someone else, someone caught in the middle of a game she didn't fully understand. Who is it? Clint demanded. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the phone, her lips moving silently as she processed the incoming information. Her eyes widened, and she let out a breath. It's them, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They found us. Before Clint could respond, the door to the warehouse crashed open, and a squad of men dressed in black tactical gear stormed inside. Their weapons were drawn, their eyes cold and calculating. There was no hesitation in their movements, they were here to eliminate threats, and Clint and Sarah were at the top of the list. Clint's instincts kicked in before he could even think. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her to the side as gunfire erupted in the direction of their last position. We need to move. Now. Clint shouted. But it was too late. The warehouse was surrounded. They were trapped. The situation had escalated from a simple confrontation to a life-or-death situation. Clint could hear the men closing in, their footsteps echoing through the concrete, the tension unbearable. He had no choice but to fight back. Get to the back exit. Clint barked at Sarah. I'll cover you. But Sarah shook her head. Not without you. We stick together, Clint. We get out together. We take them down together. Clint hesitated. His mind raced as he weighed the options. Time was running out, and their escape was growing more impossible with every passing second. But there was no time for second-guessing. They had to move. Together, they fought their way through the warehouse, facing down attackers at every corner. Clint could feel the weight of Sarah's presence by his side, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a true ally. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. As they reached the back exit, Clint stole one last glance at Dunn, who was now surrounded by the men in black. He was grinning again, as though he had already won. But Clint knew better. This was far from over. The cold night air hit Clint's face as he and Sarah burst out of the back exit into the alley. The sound of gunfire still echoed behind them, growing fainter with each passing moment, but they couldn't stop. They couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. Clint grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her into the shadows, the sounds of their pursuers growing distant. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they crouched down, hiding in the dark. The adrenaline was still surging through Clint's veins, but his mind was clear. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how to survive. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for answers, answers that had eluded him for far too long. "We're not out of the woods yet," Clint whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't being followed. "We need to find a safe place. Somewhere they won't look." Sarah nodded, but her face was grim. "They'll find us. They always do." Clint's jaw tightened, and he clenched his fists at his sides. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. There had to be a way out of this. They couldn't let the conspiracy win. Not after everything they had learned. "Then we'll make them chase us," Clint muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. They moved quickly through the alley, careful not to make a sound. The night was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. But Clint knew they couldn't rely on silence alone. They needed to get off the streets and find somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. They reached the end of the alley and ducked into a narrow street. The headlights of a car passed them by, casting long shadows across the pavement. Clint held his breath, waiting for the car to disappear before making a move. "I know a place," Sarah said, her voice low. "It's not far from here. We can lay low for a while." Clint hesitated. He didn't fully trust Sarah, not after everything that had happened, but he knew they didn't have time to argue. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. "Lead the way," Clint said, his tone flat. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. The tension between them was palpable, but there was no room for anything but survival. They couldn't afford distractions. They couldn't afford to trust anyone fully, but at the same time, they had no choice but to rely on each other. As they neared Sarah's hideout, a small apartment building on the outskirts of the city, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His senses were on high alert, every shadow and flicker of movement setting him on edge. He scanned the streets constantly, looking for any sign of their pursuers. "This place is secure," Sarah said, her voice steady, though Clint could hear the uncertainty beneath it. "No one knows about it. I've been keeping it under the radar." Clint nodded, though he was still skeptical. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. They reached the building and slipped inside. The apartment was modest, small and cluttered, but it would do for now. Sarah led Clint to the back room, where a table was covered with maps and documents. It looked like she had been preparing for this moment for a long time, gathering information, piecing things together in the hopes of finding a way out. But now, Clint realized, it was all coming to a head. Sarah pulled a chair out from the table and sat down, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. "We need to figure out what our next move is. We can't keep running forever." Clint stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her closely. "So, what's the plan?" "We just keep chasing shadows, hoping to find the real mastermind." "And what happens when we find them? How do we even begin to stop this?" Sarah looked up, her face hardening with determination. We don't have much of a choice. We can't back down now. The conspiracy's already in motion. We're too deep to turn back. But if we're going to stop them, we need to know who they are. We need to cut off the head of the snake. Clint didn't answer right away. He stared at the map on the wall, his mind churning with possibilities. He had been on the edge of uncovering the truth for so long, but every step forward seemed to lead to another dead end. How many times had he thought he was close, only to realize he was chasing a false lead? But this time, it felt different. The pieces were falling into place, and he wasn't about to stop now. "Okay," Clint said finally, his voice low. "But we do it my way. No more hiding. No more running." Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Fine. But we can't do this alone. We'll need help. We'll need someone on the inside." Clint raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we trust someone else? After everything?" Sarah took a deep breath, clearly weighing her words. "We don't have a choice. There are people we can reach out to. People who are still fighting the system from within. We can't take them all down on our own." Clint's mind raced as he thought about Sarah's words. She was right. They couldn't do this alone. But who could they trust? Who would be willing to help them take down a shadow organization that had infiltrated every level of power? As if reading his mind, Sarah spoke again. "I know someone. A former colleague. They can help us. But we have to act fast. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be to stop them." Clint didn't hesitate. "Then we move. Now." But as they prepared to leave, Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he read the message that appeared on the screen. "Clint, we know where you are. It's time to pay the price. You're running out of time." The message was from an unknown number, but Clint knew exactly who it was from. The organization had found them. And now, there was no escaping their reach. "Get ready," Clint said, his voice steely. "They found us. We need to go, now." They didn't have much time. But for Clint, the message was clear. The conspiracy was closing in on them, and the only way out was to fight back. Clint's heart raced as he and Sarah rushed through the back exit of the apartment. The message on his phone was clear: they had found them. There was no time to waste, no time for second-guessing. The moment they left the apartment, they would be exposed, vulnerable. But staying inside wasn't an option either. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Clint didn't answer right away. He had to think quickly, his mind already running through the possible options. They had a limited window of time before the organization came down on them. But he knew one thing: they needed allies. The shadow organization had already infiltrated too many areas of power for them to take on alone. They needed to reach someone on the inside. Someone who still had the courage to fight. "There's a contact I have in the FBI," Clint said, his voice low and purposeful. "She's a good agent. We can trust her." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes skeptical. "You trust her?" "I trust her more than anyone else right now," Clint said firmly. He had learned over the years to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that reaching out to this agent was their best chance. They needed information, and they needed it fast. "Fine," Sarah said, still sounding uncertain but willing to follow Clint's lead. "But we need to move. They're not going to give up." Clint nodded grimly. As much as he hated to admit it, Sarah was right. The organization wasn't going to stop. And every second they wasted put them closer to being caught. They moved quickly, heading out of the alley and into the nearest street. The city was bustling with life as usual, people walking on the sidewalks, cars honking in traffic, streetlights casting long shadows. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that every one of those strangers was a potential threat. Every corner they turned, every face they passed, was it someone working for the enemy? He pushed the thought aside. They didn't have time for paranoia. "I'll make the call," Clint said, pulling his phone from his pocket. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago, the familiar tone of the ringing phone a small comfort in the chaos. It only took a few moments before the line picked up. "Clint." The voice on the other end was low, but Clint could hear the surprise in the agent's tone. "I didn't expect to hear from you again. Agent Lisa Grant." Clint had worked with her on a number of cases in the past. She was sharp, resourceful, and most importantly, she had never been afraid to bend the rules when it came to fighting for the truth. Clint had trusted her with his life before, and now, he was asking for that trust again. "Lisa," Clint said, keeping his voice low, "I need your help. We're in deep, and I'm not sure how much longer we have." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Clint could hear the sound of shuffling papers, the faint hum of a computer in the background. "What's going on?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with concern. "It's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. I can't explain everything right now, but we need to get off the radar. We need a safe place to lay low for a while. And we need to know what the organization knows about us." Lisa was silent for a moment, clearly processing what Clint had just said. Then, her voice came back, stronger and more determined. "I'll do what I can. But you're not going to like what I have to tell you." Clint's stomach twisted. He didn't have time for bad news. "What do you mean?" "The organization has been keeping an eye on you," Lisa said, her voice low but urgent. "They know you're still alive. And they know you've been digging into them. You're already a target." Clint's pulse quickened. He knew the organization was dangerous, but he hadn't expected them to be so thorough. They were one step ahead, always. Always watching. "Where can we meet?" Clint asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rising tension. "I have a safe house about an hour outside the city," Lisa replied. "But you need to get here fast. It's the only place I can guarantee you won't be followed." Clint glanced at Sarah, his eyes narrowing. They didn't have a choice. They had to trust Lisa. There was no time to think it over. The organization was closing in, and their only chance of survival was to stay one step ahead. "On our way," Clint said, hanging up the phone. He turned to Sarah, his expression resolute. "We've got an hour before they figure out where we are. Let's move." They ran through the streets, taking a winding route through alleyways and side streets, doing everything they could to avoid being tracked. Clint's mind was racing, but he knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. The organization had resources that could track them no matter how hard they tried to hide. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Clint felt a sense of unease settle over him. This was uncharted territory for him. He had always been the one on the offense, the one making the moves. Now, he was the one being hunted. The journey to the safe house felt endless, the weight of the world pressing down on him with every mile they put between themselves and the city. He kept looking over his shoulder, but all he saw was the same empty stretch of road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a secluded farmhouse at the end of a long, dirt driveway. The place looked deserted, the windows dark, the only sign of life the faint glow of a light coming from the back. Clint's nerves were on edge. Every part of him was telling him to be cautious, but they had no choice. This was the only option. "Stay close," Clint muttered to Sarah as they approached the back door. He knocked once, twice. They waited, every sound making Clint's heart race. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Lisa stepped out, her expression stern but relieved to see them. "Come in," she said quickly, ushering them inside. Clint and Sarah stepped into the small, dimly lit room, the scent of old wood and stale air filling their lungs. Clint's eyes scanned the room, assessing the situation. The house looked old and run down, but it was clear that Lisa had taken precautions to ensure it was safe. "We need to talk," Lisa said, leading them into a small kitchen area. "And I need to know everything you've uncovered. The organization is too dangerous to play around with." Clint's gaze hardened as he sat down, the weight of the situation sinking in. "We don't have much time," he said. "I don't know what they want from us, but they won't stop until we're dead." Lisa nodded grimly, but her eyes were filled with determination. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen. Together." Clint and Sarah exchanged a look. There was no going back now. They had crossed a line, and the only way out was through. The safe house was quiet, the oppressive silence only broken by the sound of the wind brushing against the old farmhouse. Clint sat at the worn kitchen table, his mind racing. The walls were closing in on them, and they had little time to plan. Lisa had given them a safe spot for the moment, but Clint knew that safety was temporary. The shadow organization would be relentless. Sarah paced back and forth, clearly anxious. She had a nervous energy about her that Clint had seen before, a kind of tension that made her look like she was ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. "You're not going to like this," Lisa said, breaking the silence. She stood by the stove, her arms folded across her chest. The lines on her face were deeper than Clint remembered, and he could sense the weight of the burden she was carrying. Clint's gaze didn't leave her as he spoke. "What's going on, Lisa? What don't we know?" Lisa hesitated, then sighed. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, setting it down on the table between them. "This is the latest intel we've got on the organization," she said. "They've been tracking you, Clint. They've known you were looking into them for weeks. The more you dig, the more they learn about you." Clint's stomach tightened as he opened the folder. The first page was a detailed timeline of his movements, places he had visited, people he had spoken to, even his personal contacts. It was all there. Everything. The organization had been monitoring his every step, and that meant they knew exactly where to hit him hardest. "I don't get it," Clint muttered, scanning the pages. "How could they know this much about me?" Lisa looked grim. "They've been watching everyone, Clint. They have eyes everywhere. People you think you can trust, they're compromised. And that's the problem. We're running out of safe spaces." Sarah clenched her fists, frustration clearly mounting. "You mean we've been walking into a trap this whole time?" "Not exactly," Lisa replied. "But think about it. The people you've been talking to, people you thought were allies, they may not be. There's always someone watching. Always someone listening." Clint rubbed his forehead. This was the harsh reality of the situation. He had always believed that he could fight against the system, but this was different. The organization was insidious, working its way into every crevice of society. And now, they were closing in. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Clint said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "If they know every move I've made, we need to turn the tables. We need to get ahead of them." Lisa's eyes sharpened as she considered his words. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "There's a way we can do this, but it's risky. We can use their own surveillance network against them. The thing is, it will take time. And we'll need inside help." Clint's pulse quickened. "Inside help? Who?" Lisa leaned in, lowering her voice. "There's a mole inside the organization. Someone who has been feeding us information for months. But they're in deep. We can't contact them directly without putting them, and ourselves, at risk." Clint's mind raced as he processed this new information. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. They weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to dismantle a massive network. And now, they had a mole on the inside. This mole, can we trust them? Sarah asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Lisa nodded slowly. "I've been in contact with them. They've given us useful intel. But we don't know who they are. We don't even know if they're alive. They've been operating under a code name, Phantom. Clint leaned back in his chair, his mind whirling. Phantom. The name sent a chill down his spine. Was this mole someone he knew? Someone close to him? The possibilities were endless. We don't have much time, Lisa said, breaking him from his thoughts. If we want to take down this organization, we need to act now. We can't keep hiding. And we can't trust anyone. Clint stood up abruptly. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every choice from here on out would either bring them closer to victory, or doom them. We don't have a choice, Clint said, his voice sharp with resolve. We take the fight to them. But Lisa wasn't done. There's one more thing you need to know. The leader of the organization, they know who you are. They've been waiting for this. They know you're getting close, Clint. Clint's stomach dropped. He had known this day would come, but hearing it from Lisa made it all the more real. Who is it? Clint asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lisa looked at him, her eyes haunted. We don't know yet. But there are whispers, rumors, some say it's someone inside the government. Someone powerful. Someone who's above the law. The realization hit Clint like a punch to the gut. He had suspected that the organization was entrenched deep within the corridors of power, but this was something else. The leader wasn't just some faceless figure in the shadows. They were someone with influence, someone who could pull strings at the highest levels. Sarah exhaled sharply. This just keeps getting worse. Clint didn't respond. His mind was already working, running through every possibility. If they were going to take down the organization, they needed more than just a mole. They needed an army. They needed leverage. And most importantly, they needed to find out who was pulling the strings. We'll need to reach out to Phantom, Clint said, his voice grim. They're our only chance. Lisa nodded. I'll make the call. But be prepared, if we don't act fast, they'll come after us next. You can't stay in hiding forever, Clint. The clock is ticking. Clint clenched his fists, his jaw tight. Then let's make it count. Whatever happens next, we end this. For good. With that, Clint, Sarah, and Lisa were left to face the impossible truth. They were in a war that would change everything. There would be no safe places. No more hiding. Every move would have consequences. The organization had already infiltrated every level of power, and now, Clint was determined to take it down, no matter the cost. The farmhouse was quiet, too quiet for Clint's liking. The oppressive atmosphere inside felt like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Clint stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There was something unsettling about the calm before the storm. They were about to make their move, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the organization was always one step ahead of them. Sarah was pacing again, the same anxious energy that had filled her movements since they'd arrived. Clint couldn't blame her, it wasn't just the walls closing in, it was the uncertainty. Everything had been so meticulously calculated up until now. They had a plan, but the more they learned about the organization, the more it felt like they were entering a trap. Clint, Sarah said, her voice strained, do you think Phantom is really out there? I mean, we're talking about someone who's been feeding us information from the inside. Someone who knows how deep this goes. But we've never seen them, never spoken to them face to face. How can we trust them? Clint's jaw tightened. He had the same doubts, but he couldn't show them. Not now. If we don't trust Phantom, we don't have a chance. They've given us real intel, and they've been right so far. We don't have time to question every lead we get. We have to trust that Phantom will help us. Sarah stopped pacing and looked Clint in the eyes. What if it's a setup? What if they're feeding us lies to keep us on the run? Clint considered that. It was a possibility. Phantom could very well be someone who had an agenda of their own, someone using them as pawns. But Clint didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. Every moment they wasted could be the difference between life and death. "We won't know unless we try," Clint replied, his voice firm. "We need to get to the next phase. If Phantom is real, we need to find them. If they're not, then we'll deal with that when the time comes." Sarah nodded slowly, clearly not fully convinced but willing to go along with Clint's decision. "I just don't like this feeling, Clint. It feels like we're walking straight into a lion's den." Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and turned toward Lisa, who had been silently watching them. "Do you have any idea where Phantom might be? Where we can meet them?" Lisa stood up, moving toward a small, cluttered desk in the corner. She sifted through some papers before pulling out a crumpled map. "I have a location," she said. "But it's not going to be easy to get there. The place is off the grid, somewhere even the organization might not have full access to." Clint took the map and studied it. The location was deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was an isolated area, which made sense. If Phantom was trying to stay off the radar, they wouldn't be anywhere easy to find. "This is the place," Clint said, pointing to a spot on the map. "How far is it?" Lisa glanced at the map. "It's about 2 hours from here, but it's not the distance that's the problem. It's the route. You'll need to take a series of backroads, and even then, you can't rely on GPS. The whole area's been scrubbed of any digital trace." Clint nodded, already knowing what that meant. No technology. No communication with the outside world. It was a place where anyone who went there was on their own. "That's the kind of place we need," Clint said, his tone resolute. "Get ready. We leave in 30 minutes." The group moved quickly, preparing for what could be their final journey. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty fields outside the farmhouse. The air was thick with tension as Sarah packed a small bag, her hands shaking ever so slightly. Clint couldn't blame her, every step they took was a risk. As they loaded into the car, Clint's thoughts were clouded with questions. Was Phantom really someone they could trust? Or was this a trap? And even if they did find Phantom, would they be able to stop the organization in time? Clint pushed the doubts aside. They had no other choice. This was the only path forward. The safe house had already been compromised. The organization knew where they were, and it was only a matter of time before they came for them. But with Phantom's help, they had a shot at striking back. As the car pulled away from the farmhouse, Clint took one last look at the house that had been their refuge. It wasn't much, but it had given them a brief moment of safety. A brief moment to regroup. But that moment was over. The clock was ticking. The journey to Phantom's location was silent. The road wound through dense woods, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Clint drove with a single-minded focus, his grip on the steering wheel tight. The further they drove, the more isolated the world became. The trees towered above them, closing in, like the jaws of a trap. The air felt heavier with every mile. As they neared their destination, Clint slowed the car, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The map indicated that they were close, but in an area this remote, anything could be hiding. "We're almost there," Clint muttered, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the trees on either side. Sarah looked out the window, her face pale under the moonlight. "I don't like this. It's too quiet." Clint said nothing, focusing entirely on the road. They had been on edge for days now. Every step had led them here, and they couldn't afford to hesitate. The only thing that mattered now was getting to Phantom and finding out what they knew. Finally, the car came to a stop at a small clearing in the woods. The place was desolate, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Clint turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, waiting. "Is this it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clint nodded, scanning the area. There was no sign of life, no obvious markers. It was just darkness and trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. "This is it," Clint said. "Stay alert." He stepped out of the car, his senses on high alert. Every noise seemed amplified in the stillness, footsteps on the dirt, the snap of a twig underfoot. Sarah and Lisa followed him closely, their eyes darting around in the shadows. Then, just as Clint thought they were alone, a figure emerged from the trees. It was a man, tall and cloaked in darkness. He wore a hood, his face obscured, but there was no mistaking the weight of his presence. "Clint Eastwood," the man said, his voice cold and measured. "I've been expecting you." Clint's heart raced. It was Phantom, but was it really him? Or was this another trap? "Are you Phantom?" Clint asked, his voice steady despite the tension. The man gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "I am." The shadows around them seemed to grow deeper, and for the first time since arriving, Clint felt the weight of what he was about to do. If Phantom was the real deal, then they might finally have a chance to stop the organization. But if not, if this was a setup. Clint didn't let his doubts show. He couldn't afford to. "We need your help," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "We need to know everything you know about the organization." The man's hooded gaze never left him. "I've been watching you, Clint. And I know exactly what you're up against. But first, we need to make sure we're not being followed." Clint nodded, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. The figure before them, Phantom, stood in the shadows, his presence commanding despite his silence. Clint's mind raced. Every instinct told him to stay on guard, that they were stepping into a trap, but there was no turning back now. They needed answers, and Phantom was the only one who could give them the intel they so desperately sought. Clint stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the figure. Phantom's silence lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken words. "You've been watching us," Clint said, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "Now it's time to talk. We need to know everything about the organization. Who runs it? Where do they operate from? How do we destroy it?" Phantom didn't immediately respond, and Clint felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every second felt like an eternity, and in that silence, his doubts began to grow. Was this really their ally? Or were they about to walk into another trap? Finally, Phantom spoke, his voice low and grave. "The organization is far more powerful than you realize, Clint. They have their hands in every part of society, government, business, law enforcement. The people you've been trusting, the people you've been fighting for, they might be compromised." Clint felt his pulse quicken. He had suspected the organization was everywhere, but hearing it from Phantom felt like a slap in the face. They were no longer just fighting shadowy figures from the outside, they were up against an institution that had woven itself into the very fabric of society. "You're not telling me anything new," Clint said, his tone sharp. "I already know they've infiltrated every level of power. But we need to know who's at the top. Who's pulling the strings?" Phantom's gaze hardened, and he stepped closer, his face still hidden beneath the hood. "I can give you names," he said slowly, "but be warned, these people are untouchable. You've already seen what happens when you try to take them down. They have resources, influence, and they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who stands in their way." Clint clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid of them." Sarah, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know who's behind it all? The one in charge?" A slight, almost imperceptible movement crossed Phantom's face, a shift that Clint couldn't quite place. The figure seemed to hesitate, as though considering whether to reveal what he knew. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, Phantom answered. "The leader is someone you both know," Phantom said, his voice tight with restraint. Someone close to you. Clint's stomach dropped. The words hung in the air, the weight of them too heavy to immediately comprehend. Someone close to you. The phrase echoed in his mind, a warning, a promise of devastation. Sarah's eyes widened. What? Who? Phantom looked directly at Clint, his words slow and deliberate. It's Lisa. The air around them seemed to thicken, and for a moment, Clint couldn't speak. The shock was overwhelming. Lisa. The woman who had helped them, who had been their ally in this fight against the organization. The woman who had provided them with shelter and guidance. How could she be involved with the very thing they were fighting? No, Clint muttered, shaking his head. That's impossible. Lisa's been on our side this whole time. Phantom didn't flinch. I know it's hard to believe, but the evidence is clear. She's been feeding information to the organization. She's been playing both sides. Sarah's face paled, and she stepped back, as if trying to distance herself from the revelation. This can't be true. Lisa would never. She's been doing it for a long time, Phantom interrupted, his voice cold. Every time you think you've outsmarted them, she's been there, feeding them your next move. The organization knew where you'd be, when you'd make your next move, all because Lisa's been in the game from the start. Clint's mind raced. The betrayal was too much to process. Lisa, his friend, his ally, was working with the enemy. The one person he had trusted above all others had been playing them like pawns. No, Clint said again, his voice hoarse now. I don't believe you. There has to be a mistake. You have to be wrong. Phantom's expression softened ever so slightly, almost as if he understood the pain Clint was feeling. I wish I was wrong, Clint. But the truth is, the organization has been watching you from the beginning. Lisa has been part of their inner circle for years. Clint's thoughts were swirling, his emotions a mix of disbelief and anger. He had known betrayal was a possibility, but this? This was a gut punch like no other. The person he had trusted most, the one who had given him hope in the darkest moments, had been deceiving him all along. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. If Lisa's been working for them, then we have to stop her. We can't trust her anymore. Clint stood there, his body rigid with the weight of the truth. He had to make a choice now. The battle had just taken a devastating turn. They couldn't go back to the farmhouse. They couldn't trust anyone they had once considered an ally. Everything had changed. I'm not going after her just yet, Clint said, his voice low. We need more information. If Lisa is part of the organization, then she knows things we need to know. But we need to be careful. We can't let her know we're on to her. Not yet. Phantom nodded. That's the smart move. You're going to need to play your cards carefully. You'll never know who's watching. Clint's fists clenched as he thought about Lisa. The pain of betrayal was sharp, like a dagger twisting in his chest. But he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had to stay focused. The fate of everyone he cared about depended on it. We move forward, Clint said, his voice hard as steel. We find out what Lisa knows, and then we bring the organization down. No matter what it takes. The forest around them was dark, the trees tall and silent as Clint stood frozen, his mind racing. The world as he knew it had just fractured into pieces, each fragment sharp and cutting. Lisa, their ally, had been a double agent all along. How had he missed it? How had Sarah missed it? The betrayal stung like poison coursing through his veins, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they had been walking blindfolded, one step away from their undoing. Phantom stood still, observing them, waiting. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Clint's mind was spinning. He couldn't look at Sarah. He couldn't even look at Phantom. Not yet. His thoughts kept racing back to Lisa, the woman who had helped them when they were cornered, the one who had been their friend. She had smiled at him, laughed with him, and they had shared their hopes. How could she have been feeding information to the very people they were fighting against? Had it all been an act? Finally, Clint broke the silence, his voice low but laced with raw anger. I need proof. I need to see the evidence. If you want me to believe this, you'd better show me the damn proof. Phantom didn't flinch. I'm not here to convince you of anything, Clint. I'm just here to give you the truth. Clint stepped forward, his fists clenched. He had to stay calm. They couldn't afford to fall apart now, not when they were so close to the heart of the organization. He needed to keep his focus. They still had a job to do, no matter how much it hurt. You're asking me to trust you, Phantom, and you're giving me nothing but vague threats. I need more than this. Show me the proof, or we're done here. There was a moment of stillness before Phantom nodded. I understand. I'll get you the proof. But first, you need to understand the bigger picture. Lisa wasn't working alone. The organization's reach goes far beyond what you've seen. She was just a small part of it. Clint's jaw tightened. Phantom was right. The organization had infiltrated more than just their small circle. They were everywhere. If Lisa was truly a part of it, then there were more people they couldn't trust, more faces hiding the truth. I don't care about the bigger picture, Clint snapped. I want Lisa. I want to know what she knows. Phantom's gaze hardened. You'll find her. But it won't be easy. She's always one step ahead. If you go after her now, you'll be walking into a trap. Clint didn't respond at first. The thought of chasing Lisa, of confronting her, twisted his insides. But Phantom was right. The longer they waited, the more chances Lisa had to cover her tracks, to disappear into the shadows. The clock was ticking, and they needed answers. The organization was too powerful to let this go unchecked. I'm not waiting any longer, Clint said firmly. We need to move on her now. Sarah, who had been silent for a long while, finally spoke. Clint, we need to be smart about this. If Phantom is right, Lisa could have a whole network of people behind her. We can't just go in guns blazing. Clint turned to face her, his expression hard. We don't have time for smart. We don't have time for anything. If Lisa is part of this, then she's already put all of us in danger. Every second we waste is another second the organization gets closer to destroying us. Sarah met Clint's gaze, her eyes filled with doubt but also determination. I know, Clint. I get it. But we have to think this through. We can't just charge in like it's a battlefield. We need a plan. Clint took a deep breath, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He wanted to storm after Lisa, drag her back and make her tell him everything she knew. But Sarah was right. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not now. All right, Clint said, his voice steady but tense. We get the proof, we figure out where Lisa is, and then we strike. But we don't go in without knowing exactly what we're up against. Phantom's voice cut through the air. There's one more thing you need to know. Lisa's not the only one you have to worry about. The organization is planning something bigger. If you don't stop them soon, they'll be unstoppable. Clint felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. What do you mean by bigger? What are they planning? Phantom hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if considering how much to reveal. They're planning an operation, one that will put them above the law for good. A new leader, new technology, and total control. They've already made their move, Clint. The clock's ticking. Clint's heart pounded. It was worse than he thought. The organization wasn't just trying to maintain power, they were planning to consolidate it, to become untouchable. If that happened, there would be no stopping them. We need to stop them, Clint said, his voice firm, resolved. We can't let this happen. We can't let them win. Phantom nodded. Then you need to find Lisa and get the information she has. It's the key to stopping them. The group fell into silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Clint could feel the crushing burden of responsibility. It wasn't just about the fight anymore, it was about survival. If they failed now, everything they had fought for would be lost. After a long moment, Clint looked at Sarah and Lisa, his voice calm but unyielding. We move now. We don't waste any more time. The car ride was tense. The headlights cut through the darkness as they drove toward their next move. Clint could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. They were walking into the unknown, and there was no way to predict what lay ahead. The road was long, and there was no guarantee they would survive it. Sarah was sitting next to him, her eyes distant. Clint knew she was just as shaken by the revelation of Lisa's betrayal as he was. But they couldn't afford to let it break them. They had a job to do, and they had to stay focused. What do we do if we find her? Sarah asked quietly. We take her down, Clint replied, his voice cold. We get the information, and we stop the organization. What if she's already gone? What if we can't catch her in time? Clint didn't answer right away. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He had no idea what would happen if they didn't find Lisa soon. But he couldn't let himself think that way. They had to try. They had no other choice. We'll figure it out, Clint said finally. We have to. As they drove deeper into the night, Clint felt the weight of the coming confrontation pressing on him. They were about to face a betrayal that would shake them to their core. But even in the face of the unknown, Clint knew one thing for sure, he couldn't stop now. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The dark, rainy night mirrored Clint's state of mind, heavy, uncertain, and brimming with tension. The windshield wipers squeaked against the downpour, barely able to keep up with the relentless rain that seemed to fall in sheets, blurring the world around them. Clint's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white, his thoughts consumed by the mission ahead. Clint glanced at Sarah beside him, who sat with her arms crossed, her face shadowed in the dim light of the car. There was a sense of silence between them now, a rift that had opened ever since Phantom had revealed the truth about Lisa. Clint wanted to reach out, reassure her, but there was no easy way to undo the damage caused by the betrayal. They both knew the stakes, and they both knew what they had to do. I'm sorry, Clint, Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the hum of the engine and the sound of rain against the roof. I should have seen it sooner. I should have known something was wrong. Clint shook his head, keeping his eyes on the road. It's not your fault. We were all taken in. The organization is good at what they do. They play the long game. I can't believe it, Sarah continued. Lisa, she was our friend. How could she do this to us? Clint didn't have an answer. He didn't understand it either. Lisa had been a key part of their plan, someone they trusted with their lives. And now? She was the enemy. His heart ached with the thought of confronting her. But there was no time for hesitation. They had a job to do, and there was no going back. We'll get the truth, Clint said, his voice firm. We'll make sure this ends, no matter the cost. The car slid through the slick streets, heading toward the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This was where Lisa was supposed to be, according to Phantom. Clint wasn't sure what they would find when they arrived, but he knew one thing, the confrontation was inevitable. As they approached the warehouse, Clint slowed the car, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The place was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Clint parked the car a few hundred yards away and turned off the engine. This is it, he said, his voice low but resolute. Sarah nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Clint, are you sure about this? If we walk in there, it's not just Lisa we're up against. It's the whole organization. I know, Clint replied, his jaw tight. But we can't let her keep playing both sides. If we're going to stop this, we have to stop her first. They got out of the car and started making their way toward the warehouse, the rain soaking their clothes in minutes. Clint's mind was spinning. He could feel the weight of everything they had fought for pressing down on him. One wrong move and it could all be over. But there was no room for fear, not now. They had to do this. The warehouse loomed in front of them, a hulking structure that seemed to swallow the surrounding light. Clint motioned for Sarah to stay low as they crept closer, careful not to make any noise. There was no telling who, or what, was waiting for them inside. Clint pulled out his gun, checking it one last time. He was used to danger, used to the chaos of a life spent in constant fight or flight, but this? This was personal. He wasn't just facing enemies, he was facing the woman he thought he knew. And that hurt more than he cared to admit. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. The faint sound of movement reached their ears, and Clint's heart began to pound. This was it. They were close. They moved deeper into the building, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of grime on the floor. Then, in the far corner, they saw her. Lisa. She was standing alone, her back to them, as if she was waiting for them to arrive. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting an eerie glow over her silhouette. Lisa, Clint said, his voice steady but edged with a hint of pain. It's over. We know what you've been doing. Lisa turned slowly, her face emotionless. For a moment, Clint thought he saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, but it was gone before he could be sure. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Clint, Lisa said, her voice cold and controlled. I knew you'd find out eventually. You've been working with them all along, Clint spat, his eyes narrowing. The organization. You've been playing both sides. Lisa didn't flinch. You don't understand, Clint. You never did. The organization is power. It's a force you can't fight. I've made my choices, and I'm not going to apologize for them. Clint's stomach twisted with anger. He had trusted her. She had been the one person who had stood by him, who had helped him fight. And now, she was telling him that all of it had been a lie. You're wrong, Clint said, his voice thick with emotion. This isn't about power. It's about people. It's about doing what's right. Lisa's expression softened, just a little. And you think what you're doing is right? You think you're going to change anything? The organization has already won. You're just too blind to see it. Clint's grip on his gun tightened. No. You're wrong. We're going to stop them. We're going to stop you. Before he could take another step, Lisa raised her hand, signaling for someone else to emerge from the shadows. Clint's heart skipped a beat as more figures appeared, emerging from the darkness, all armed and ready. The organization wasn't just in the shadows, it was here, standing right in front of him. Clint, I'm sorry, Lisa said, her voice barely a whisper. But this is the end. With a sharp motion, she signaled for the others to advance. Clint's mind raced, trying to calculate their next move. They were surrounded, and he didn't know how many more were waiting in the wings. This was a trap, and they had walked right into it. Sarah looked at Clint, her face grim. What now? Clint's eyes scanned the room, calculating their chances. We fight. We fight until we can't anymore. But as he said it, Clint felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't just about Lisa anymore. It was about the fight for survival. They had come too far to back down now, even if it meant facing impossible odds. The tension in the air was palpable as the figures surrounding Clint and Sarah closed in. The dim light from the flickering overhead lamps only made the scene more surreal, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them, like hands reaching out to drag them into the depths. Clint's pulse quickened. The warehouse, once a place of forgotten tools and machinery, had now become a battleground. Lisa stood across from them, her expression cold and unreadable, as though she had already accepted the outcome. Clint could see the faintest hint of something in her eyes. Was it regret? Pity? But whatever it was, it quickly vanished, replaced by the steel resolve of someone who had made their choices. Behind her, the men and women of the organization waited, their weapons at the ready. Clint's mind raced. He had prepared for many things, danger, betrayal, the unknown, but this? This was different. This was personal. Sarah, her face set in a determined mask, pulled out her own gun, but Clint stopped her with a sharp glance. She met his gaze, understanding immediately that rushing into this was a fool's game. They needed to think. "We don't have to do this, Lisa," Clint said, his voice firm but not without a trace of sorrow. "You don't have to be a part of this. We can still make it right. We can take them down together." Lisa's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think I haven't heard that before? You don't get it, Clint. The organization is more than just a group of people. It's a system, a way of life. You can't fight it. You can't win. You're already too late." Clint's heart pounded. He hated how she made it sound so final, so absolute. But he refused to accept it. "I'm not giving up on you. I'm not giving up on any of this. Not now. Not ever." For a moment, Clint thought he saw something flicker in Lisa's eyes, doubt, perhaps. But then it was gone, replaced by something colder. "I never asked you to," she said flatly. "But it's over. This is the end, Clint. For you, for Sarah, for all of you." Lisa nodded, and at her signal, the men and women around them stepped forward, guns raised. Clint's instincts screamed at him to act, to move, to fight, but he held back. They had no chance in a direct fight. The room was too large, the odds stacked too high. Sarah looked at him, her eyes a mixture of determination and fear. "Clint, we can't win this. Not here, not now. We need a way out." Clint's mind was racing. There had to be something, some way they could turn the tables. He couldn't let this be the end, not like this. Not with Lisa, not with so much left unresolved. In a sudden flash of inspiration, Clint's gaze shifted to the ceiling. The large metal rafters high above them seemed to taunt him, almost mocking the desperation of the moment. It was risky, it was reckless, but it was the only option they had. "Sarah," Clint whispered urgently, "we need to get to the rafters. We need to climb." Sarah's eyes widened in understanding, but she hesitated for a split second, looking back at Lisa and the others. Clint could see the hesitation in her eyes. They had a slim chance of getting out of this alive, but they had to take it. "On my mark," Clint said, his voice barely a whisper, steady despite the pounding adrenaline in his veins. "Ready?" Sarah nodded. "Let's do it." Before Lisa could give another order, Clint lunged, grabbing Sarah by the arm and pulling her toward the large metal columns at the edge of the room. The sound of footsteps and gunshots rang out behind them, but Clint didn't look back. There was no time. They made it to the base of one of the metal beams, just in time to hear the whiz of bullets whizzing past them. Clint reached up, grabbing hold of a metal rung and pulling himself up with all his strength. Sarah followed, her hands shaking as she climbed after him. The sound of boots on the concrete floor echoed below, the people of the organization closing in on their position. But Clint didn't stop. Neither did Sarah. The rungs of the metal ladder felt slick with rainwater, but Clint pushed forward. He could feel his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. If they could just make it to the top. Suddenly, a voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Stop them. Don't let them escape." Clint's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to focus. The warehouse was massive, but the rafters would give them the height they needed to escape, or at least to get to a vantage point. But the seconds were ticking away, and every moment of hesitation meant another inch closer to being caught. When they finally reached the top, Clint pulled Sarah up, and they crouched low, hidden behind the beams. Below them, the organization's soldiers moved in circles, searching for their targets. Clint's eyes scanned the room, looking for an exit. The only problem? The entire warehouse was surrounded. There was no way out except through. For a moment, everything went still. Then, without warning, a series of loud cracks echoed through the building, the sound of doors slamming open, and the unmistakable screech of tires on wet pavement. "They're here," Clint muttered, realization dawning on him. "We've got company." Suddenly, the door at the far end of the warehouse exploded open, and the sharp sound of gunfire rang out. Clint's pulse raced as chaos erupted below. The soldiers of the organization scattered, diving for cover, while the sound of a car engine roaring to life echoed from the street outside. The cavalry had arrived. Clint's heart pounded, his grip tightening on the beam. He wasn't sure who had shown up, but whoever they weren't here to help the organization. That much was clear. He and Sarah had one shot to get down, to move, to escape while the chaos raged on. "Clint, we need to move," Sarah urged, her voice tight. "We can't stay up here forever." Clint took a deep breath. The danger was still there, lurking below. But now, with the help of whoever had just arrived, they might have a chance. "On three," Clint said, his voice a low whisper. "We get down, we make a run for it." They both took a deep breath, preparing for the next phase of their escape. There was no turning back now. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as he and Sarah crouched on the narrow metal beam, watching the chaos below. The warehouse was now alive with gunfire, shouting, and the screech of tires outside. The arrival of the mysterious group had shifted the balance of the battle, but it also made everything more unpredictable. Clint's mind raced. They didn't have much time before the organization regrouped and closed in on them. "We need to move, now," Sarah whispered urgently, glancing over her shoulder. "Before they find us up here." Clint nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The chaos on the ground was their only chance. The soldiers were distracted, scrambling to regroup, while the sound of approaching reinforcements from the unknown group outside grew louder. But Clint knew better than anyone that in situations like this, nothing was guaranteed. Taking a deep breath, Clint pulled himself up to stand, his legs trembling slightly from the climb. The beam beneath him felt precarious, but he steadied himself and extended a hand to Sarah, who was just behind him. She took it, her grip tight with both fear and determination. "Follow me," Clint whispered, his voice resolute despite the chaos. "Keep low, keep quiet. We're getting out of here." They moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows, using the high ground to stay hidden from the soldiers below. Each step felt like a calculated risk, but Clint wasn't about to waste their chance. Below, the warehouse was a maze of crates, machinery, and steel columns. The only way out was through. As they neared the far edge of the warehouse, Clint saw an opening, a fire escape ladder on the outside wall, just a few dozen feet away. The door was slightly ajar, and beyond it, he could see the silhouettes of the mysterious group that had arrived to help them. The figures were moving swiftly, taking down the organization's operatives one by one, but Clint knew that time was running out. Almost there, Clint muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the fire escape. Sarah was already moving ahead, her every step silent and calculated. They had one shot to reach that exit. If they missed it, they would be cornered. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire rang out, shattering the stillness. Clint's body reacted before his mind could catch up, instinctively pulling Sarah to the side as bullets whizzed by. The force of the impact shook the air around them, but they were still alive, still in the game. "They've spotted us," Sarah hissed, her voice tense with urgency. "Clint, we can't stay here." Clint's eyes scanned the room, every muscle in his body coiled, ready to react. The gunfire continued, now much closer. The soldiers were advancing, and they weren't wasting any time. Clint could feel the pressure mounting. "Run," he shouted, taking off at full speed, pulling Sarah along behind him. They raced across the high beams, their hearts pounding in their chests, their every step fueled by adrenaline. The fire escape was so close, but so was the enemy. Clint could hear the sounds of boots pounding the concrete below, and he knew that they were out of time. The world seemed to blur around him as they reached the fire escape door. Just as Clint pushed the door open, another volley of gunfire erupted behind them. Sarah cried out, but Clint didn't stop. They were inches from freedom. The door slammed shut behind them as they sprinted down the fire escape ladder. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Clint refused to stop. His heart was a roaring drumbeat in his ears, pushing him forward, keeping him going despite the odds. Below, the unfamiliar group of allies was holding the line, keeping the organization's soldiers distracted long enough for Clint and Sarah to escape. When they hit the ground, Clint didn't look back. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the cover of a nearby van that had just arrived. The engine was already running, and the doors swung open. A familiar face peered out, a contact Clint had worked with in the past, someone who owed him a favor. "Get in," the driver shouted. They didn't hesitate. Clint and Sarah piled into the van, the door slamming shut behind them with a resounding thud. The van lurched forward, racing down the alley and into the rain-soaked night. Clint's mind was still spinning, but there was no time to process. They were out. For now. As the van sped through the streets, Clint looked at Sarah, who was breathing heavily beside him. Her face was pale, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "We made it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're alive." Clint nodded, but his mind wasn't fully at ease yet. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the fight wasn't over. The organization was vast, and it wasn't going to stop coming after them. But for the first time in a long time, Clint allowed himself a moment of relief. "We're not done yet," Clint said, his voice firm. "But we'll figure it out. We always do." The van swerved around a corner, heading into the night, and Clint leaned back, the weight of the night's events slowly sinking in. They had made it through the worst of it, but what would happen next? The organization had been defeated, for now, but they had made enemies, and Clint knew that wasn't something that could be erased so easily. As the van disappeared into the shadows, Clint's mind raced ahead, already planning their next move. They had made it out of the warehouse alive, but they couldn't afford to stop now. There was a long road ahead, and Clint wasn't about to let it end until the fight was truly over. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?